Thanks for staying with us. This is Daybreak, and on my immediate right is the lawmaker representing Kamukunji constituency, Yusuf Hassan. Dr. Winnie Rogood joins us this morning on the broadcast, and Dr. Hassan Kanenje is on my far right. Before we went on a break, the idea of getting in or roping in parties or players that are equally interested, but they too have their own problems, don't they? America is overly occupied by what's happening in Gaza, and Europe is under greater strain because of its own security, given America's statements on NATO, on WSUs. Then how is this going to happen? And at what point do you think time will be enough, resources will be enough, and commitment will be enough to forestall the catastrophe in Sudan?
Well, I think we're going through a transitional period. And you see, if you look at the history of the world, yeah. The dialectics of global politics and geopolitics is that in every period in history, there's the rise, the decline, the decay, and the final collapse of great powers. And for example, at one time there was a great empire known as the Roman Empire. There was the other powers such as the Chinese, the Persians, the Arabs, the Ottomans, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, the Great Soviet Union, and all of those at one point went through a crisis and declined, and some of them collapsed and disappeared. So we have been in a period of the international liberal order that has existed since the Second World War, which has been dominated by the United States. And to a certain extent, what we are seeing today in the world is a crisis within this dominant power, which has overstretched itself through conflicts, through over economic crisis and so on, and is not able to grow to maintain its dominant position. And it's now been challenged. And this overstretch now is reflected in the Middle East. The fact that the United States is just one player that's not able to make any difference because there are other powers. And it reminds me of the famous saying of the Italian philosopher and political thinker Antonio Gramsci, that we are witnessing the old is dying and the new cannot be born, which reflects the twilight period that we're living in, a period of great political, economic, and social upheaval, which is reflected in what's happening in the Middle East, what is happening in Ukraine and Russia's conflict, and other parts of the world. So I think, to a certain extent, America is withdrawing or shrinking from its international responsibilities when it comes to the institutions that were created during the Second World War to deal with this new world order, the United Nations, the multilateral agencies. It's not able to, the United Nations is not able to bring about a ceasefire. The United Nations is not able to support and protect the civilians in the conflicts like the Palestinians. And these institutions have been weakened so much that America is unilaterally intervening in many conflicts and making a lot of decisions that it is not capable of controlling, because it is not the only power. It's no longer a unipolar or the single power as we've had from the experts in international relation, that it's a multipolar, maybe even multiplex environment. And it is very difficult to see how this current crisis in the global, in the geopolitics of the world is going to end because of this fragmentation. And of course, we are seeing the rise of a new power like China, which is rapidly developing technologically. And you see, power is usually either military or technology. And China's rapid rise is creating another kind of conflict point in global politics. Russia has emerged from the decline and the collapse of the Soviet Union and is asserting itself. And so I'm not seeing any quick solution to the Middle East crisis, and particularly the issue of the Palestinians, as long as America supports the unilateral, aggressive and illegal actions of Israel against the Palestinian people.
And Dr. Kanenje, that opens up the highlight of what yesterday happened at 10 Downing Street in London, where Sir Keir Starmer, just less than 10 days after the French President Emmanuel Macron also said in September at the UN General Assembly they will recognize Palestine as an independent state. And yesterday the liner there by the UK Prime Minister was then until the Israelis will come up with a substantive solution on the table to forestall what he said were shocking images and what's happening before our own eyes. How is this then also informing how the world is getting into a fluid world order, as pointed out by Hassan?
I'll go back to the words of Gramsci that Mheshimiwa just used, the old are dying and the new are not being born. I'll probably add the new are not being born fast enough to replace the old, and in terms of the world order. Now, Starmer is a centrist. He's not exactly responding to a conviction that actually that needs to be done, but I think it has to do with domestic politics in the fact that Corbyn and Sultana are forming a new party, and by yesterday there were close to 500,000 people who had registered, which is going to threaten actually the power of his own party going forward. And so this is a resurgence or revolution coming from within. And so what we see is around politicians around the world are actually being pushed by their own populations. One, Benjamin Netanyahu, he has been very consistent since his 20s, and anyone in history or historian can actually check in saying there will never be a Palestinian state. So you're not going to expect Benjamin Netanyahu to actually make that happen. I'm just going to give an example to the audience, for people to understand what is happening. Gaza is about half the size of Nairobi. In the first 3 months of the conflict alone, there were more bombs dropped on Gaza than the total number of bombs dropped on London, Hamburg and Dresden, some of the most bombed places in the Second World War, in the 6 years of the Second World War. Today, easily, you could have more bombs dropped on Gaza than any time in recorded history. Literally, the entire infrastructure has been wiped out. What is happening is not just an illegal thing. It's genocide, actually, in Gaza. Something being expressed, not just by observers, people outside, but lots of Jewish scholars, Jewish people, Jewish activists and politicians all across the world. Former Prime Minister, of Israel, was condemning Netanyahu for the kind of crimes against humanity that he's committing. Now, I think what is astounding is, and for those of us in the global south, and this is kind of a message to the collective west, there has been a stain that has been made on the global west, and that is going to be permanent for many, many years to come. Because how can we condemn actions in Ukraine that are nothing like what is actually happening in Gaza? People who are literally defenseless. When you have an apartheid system that is hell-bent on ethnic cleansing, this is not an opinion, these are facts, Now, how does this speak to our new world? One, for those of us who are democratic nicks, who believe in human rights and democracy, this challenges the faith in democracy, because much of our history in the better part of the post-World War II, we've come to believe especially that democracies cannot stand for certain things. And to the extent that democracies have been deaf and blind to what is happening, it actually challenges the notions that democracy, for instance, can deliver for people, but also that democracies cannot stand for the kind of human rights violations we see, that never again after the Holocaust meant something. Apparently, it only means something perhaps when you belong to a certain race. And so this is changing the way the global south is reorganizing itself, is also providing a room for what I call the rise of the rest to write a new narrative. The challenge is we don't have a new world order, Ayub. We have a new world disorder right now. That is why nothing is working the way everyone should is expecting to work. You know, at the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history. History hadn't even started yet. I think Fukuyama was high on some Kool-Aid, and he should go back and write that book.
Yeah, okay. and Dr. Winnie, is that disorder informed by the underfunding of critical UN agencies that we had seen, which Washington says does not align with its America First policies? And how consequential will this be, given that questions also are abound over then who fills up that vacuum?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just, back to the story on Gaza, as I was listening to our two panelists here, the first thing that came to my mind is this is also a reflection of the global international institutions like the United Nations. And as we are talking about the shifting global realities of our time, we are seeing the more evidence of the weakness of these global international institutions like the United Nations not to be able to respond to these situations as we would like. Because, young people asking, so why is the United Nations not intervening in Gaza? And this calls more reason why there needs to be reforms of these institutions. And we see even a greater a rise of other institutions speaking more clearly on the matter, like regional institutions, like the Arab League. And so as we are seeing the shift in global geopolitics, the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, the inability to silence the guns in Sudan, the inability to silence the gun in the DRC Congo, that is a reflection of a need to reform the global institutions that we have today. And the second thing that came to my mind is, as we watch our television every day, every morning, in the morning before I go to work, I look at how many people are starving. I just think about what does this mean for the fight against terror? Because this is leading a new race of citizens who will be very angry at various countries who they feel are responsible for this war. And for Kenya, I think of Kenya as a country that has been not really picking on sides, whether leaning east or west, but just the fact that we are allied to certain Western powers means that we are also at risk for our national security. So this is a concern, not just within the Middle East. It looks far away, but very soon it will be coming back home when we see rise of terror cells that have been silent for a while, and they get really agitated and angry by what we see in the global media every morning. Yeah,
which then brings us to the question of the underfunding of critical UN agencies. Who will step forward, given what Honorable Yusuf also pointed out, the emergence of powers, including China, who have challenged America's cultural and economic and military hegemon, as a military hegemon. And do you think that they can step up and fill that vacuum?
Do I respond?
Yes,
yeah. I think right now the global power like the United States seems to be looking inward. They seem to want to put their house together, yeah? And you can just take the cue from the response from Donald Trump regarding NATO and the fact that Europe needs to take up a little bit more of its burden. And I see European countries have committed to put together 5% of their GDP, which is a lot of money, to support their military. So in the same way, countries need to go back, different countries around the world, not just the global hegemons, but Kenya and all other countries within the United Nations need to rethink the financing of the institution. Another very interesting, I think, activity we are seeing is also rethinking how much they spend on different activities. And we see some agencies moving from New York, United Nations agencies are moving from New York to here, Kenya, which is a very good sign to show that there's discussion on how to restructure your money and how you're spending it in the global systems. How can we make the United Nations more efficient? And how can we give more power to other countries? I know this is a contentious issue. The issue of getting veto power for some of these countries around the world that are not necessarily the top 5 veto countries, such as the United States, China, Great Britain. So there's need for more power for other countries so that the decisions move beyond global rivalries and competition and look into inward. So the solutions are not coming from external actors. It's the same member countries that need to commit a little bit more and also commit to pushing for reforms that will lead to power being redistributed within the United Nations.
Yeah. And Honorable Yusuf, you worked at the UN before. Is it fit for purpose or just holding up under enormous pressure, especially from the big funders who contribute to that, to its kitty like America?
Well, I think the United Nations is a fundamental institution in global affairs. And if it didn't exist, it will be created in order to address issues that nations on their own cannot address. And you have focused only on the financing. The financing is only one aspect of it. The United Nations is the custodian of international law, the international legal system, which the world order is based on. And without the United Nations, there is going to be anarchy and chaos in the world, and nations would have to fend for themselves, particularly nations that are not part of that great power or regional power configuration, economic powers. And I think that is what people are not looking at. These institutions were created after the disaster of the tragedy of the Second World War, in which millions and millions of people died, in which there was a massive destruction unseen in the world before then. And what we are now seeing is a reversal of all those gains. One country in the last 24 months has violated every aspect of international law. The laws of war, the laws, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and is ethnic cleansing and wiping up a whole nation, the Palestinian nation. And the Western countries that were the leaders of this particular movement of the liberal international order are looking the other way, which has exposed the Western hypocrisy and double standards and have raised doubts about the viability of the liberal system. And I can see that there are other new forces coming into place. For example, there is the BRICS, which is now one of the fastest growing international alliance in the world, which brings large number of countries in the global south. If you remember when the United Nations was created, not many of these countries in the global south were members. Most of African countries were under colonial rule. And therefore, we didn't have much of a say in the creation and how the international system was working. And Africa and the global south have been campaigning for all these years now for a change, for a reform in the international order, so that we have global governing systems that are representative, that are equitable, that are fairer, and represent the face of the world. Africa is not there, Asia is not there, Latin America is not there. So to a certain extent, the current crisis provides an opportunity for the world, not only to strengthen the UN system, which is absolutely necessary. Whether you reform it or whether you change it is an administrative matter. But the fact is that without the United Nations, the world would not function as it is functioning now. Everybody would be fighting, every nation would be fighting for itself, and there would be wars and crises everywhere. International cooperation is not going to work. International law would be put into the dustbin of history, and that's not where the world needs to go. The world needs to be to work together through cooperation, through friendship, and there has to be some legislation or some way of working together, and the United Nations provides the foundation for that. You don't destroy an institution that can do all of that outside the nation-state system that we know of. So I think there's very important role here. Even if at the humanitarian level, if you look, the people of Gaza are starving. What agency can mount an intervention at the level to save the people of Gaza from starvation and from death? The United Nations is the only institution that is capable of doing that. But Israel and its allies in the West are doing everything to undermine that, and to undermine what works for the rest of the world. And I think they need to pull back. I'm glad that, in fact, some of the Western countries have started criticizing the ethnic cleansing and the genocide that is going on in Israel, in Palestine. And Britain's position of recognizing the state of Palestine is historic, given the fact that it is Britain that planted the current problem in the Middle East by creating a state within the state and the nation of Palestine, planting a new population, a new country in the middle of a community, an indigenous community that has existed. The source, the main cause of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict started from the Balfour Declarations. So the fact that Britain, the former British empire that created this problem, is taking a stand today is very significant, and I think would start a process in which more countries would come out to recognize the state of Palestine and to accept the existence of the Palestinian people as an independent and sovereign state.
And Dr. Kanenje, Honorable Yusuf points out the critical preservation of the rule of law and the safeguarding of the institutions of the United Nations. However, how can that happen when there is a rise in nationalism in Europe, as you had seen, which borders on hate, racism, and Islamophobia that we had seen? You have seen in America the fascism which is on the rise. Donald Trump is back at the White House. And ideally then, you have also seen the anathema towards the ICC when it indicted the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which was never a similar call when African heads of state were tried before the court for crimes against humanity. How then can this be done? And you had seen also the barrage of attacks against Agnes Callamard, who had documented right abuses, the special rapporteur on human rights abuses of the United Nations. In this context then, how can this happen when there is an open bias for one country, for example, yet there are rules and order that must be preserved for the world to be in harmony?
As Mheshimiwa said, when the United Nations was being founded, most countries in Africa as well as the Global South were not even independent yet. I think there was slightly more than 50, countries. And so one thing that has been lacking is the agency of much actually of the world. I've always challenged some of my friends, especially because, in the Western world, when we discuss about international community, because most of the time international community rarely does it actually refer to the entire world. A lot of times, if there are complaints about the international community, it's about the collective West, which comprise about only 12% of the world population. 88% of the world population is outside that. And so 88% of the world population is actually outside the critical decision-making, organs of the international system. Now, that is not sustainable. Now, you raise an issue about open bias, Yes, that's all the more reason why we need to reform the international system, to be able to build more agency and for countries to have more say. Why would you have the same countries in the P5 since 1945 when both the world economy, geopolitics, as well as populations have changed? The world is not the same. Number two, I think as Yusuf said, there is a change, there is a shift that is taking place. And so it's a period of relative chaos, so to speak. But then there is urgency to recognize that unless we actually start going back to the rules-based international system, it cannot be sustainable. Part of the actions, unilateral actions being taken by countries is in response to what is perceived progressively, or what has evolved as a trend of unilateralism in the better part of the last 30 years. Immediately following the outbreak of the conflict in Ukraine, Ambassador Kimani gave an extremely eloquent speech at the United Nations, which was lauded by a lot of people around the world, especially our friends in the West. And one thing I've been very keen in talking about that speech is we focused a lot more on the 2/3 of the speech. The last part of the speech of Kimani, he spoke about the trend of unilateralism being practiced by members, including members of the Security Council. And that is what has sent a wrong message that both big as well as emerging powers, they are intervening in countries unilaterally with impunity. You see, to the extent where you do not know what happens next. We don't know where the war is going to start next. The other day, even the framing of it, Israel launched what they called a preemptive attack. There is nothing like that in international law against Iran, assassinating its leaders, you know. But what do you hear? They're talking about a war. No, that was actually a country attacking another against the United Nations. But they can do that. You know why? Because they can. Why? Because other countries are actually doing the same thing. And unless we actually go back, we'll not be able to address whether the conflict in the Middle East or in Europe, or even the conflict is going on in Africa. So I think it's important, especially as there is a relative decline of Western agency in controlling international affairs, there is a responsibility to those who are emerging to start putting their heads together and say, how can we be able to shape the agenda? And we have seen an effort being done on Gaza right now, not starting in the traditional capitals, but elsewhere. There should also be efforts in other theaters to start defining the message, setting an agenda, and shaping the discourse, because that is the only way, going back to the rules-based international system, that we can actually truly going to secure and save the world.
Yeah. Is that why, Dr. Winnie, we are seeing less attention on, for example, the crisis in Sudan, the long-time instability status in Somalia, the DRC, as we had seen, it took the Qatari government's effort to bring Paul Kagame and Felix Tshisekedi together through the Emir of Qatar, Al Thani. How is this then messaging the commitment by the West as it had always projected itself of advancing good values, democracy and human rights?
Yeah, and I think then the next point I was going to talk about is values, value system. Yeah, and the value system, the rule-based order is based on a value system of respect for human rights, intervening in periods of human rights catastrophes and where you have human rights violations. And we're clearly seeing from the last two speakers, there's a question about the rule-based order as it is right now. But what I'm really finding interesting inspiration from is looking at how the European Union is restructuring itself. The need to hold back to those values and cling to them in this time where many, can we say, countries like the United States, we're used to them intervening in this crisis or calling for a cessation of hostilities. We are seeing less of that intervention. And so looking at how the European Union is sticking to their value system. Again, back to the Finland president, I really listened to him because he was saying something very interesting about how other countries are restructuring in this very flux geopolitical order. And one of the things he talked about when it comes to the Finnish foreign policy is the interest in value-based foreign policy system. So based on that question of value, I think even the African Union countries can go back to our own value system. We value democracy, not only democracy, but human rights and respect for the rights of people. And when we see different regions coming together and speaking more loudly about this need to strengthen the rule-based order, it gives me hope. And so I think I'll just comment on that European perspective.
Yeah. And Honorable Yusuf, then, if we are to move this conversation forward, ideally you have talked about the emergence of America from World War II as the sole superpower, but of course the changes over time have also been informed by global dynamics, including a continental Europe that is aging, an America that is finding its place as the sole superpower challenged. But is it worrying also when the holder of the office in Washington praises autocrats and causes up to dictators?
But, you know, in terms of foreign policy, there isn't democracy is not reflected. Yeah. The United States has supported many autocratic regimes. It's been involved in undermining and the removal of democratic states that have opposed America's policy, for example, in Latin America and many parts of the world. It has intervened on many issues to protect its self-interest, regardless of its democratic credentials. So I think the United States has to maintain relationship. Autocracy, dictatorship is something that is subjective. When you describe, in fact, a country like China or as a dictatorship, it is a subjective response, which is mostly a negative perception of an opponent of China. But China would claim, would say that it's more democratic, perhaps than some of the liberal democracies in the world. So I would say that in terms of foreign policy, every country has relationship with all the countries of the world. For example, we have embassies in countries that never hold elections, but because of our own economic and political interests, we maintain those relationships, and America is not an exception. What is an exception is when you undermine the rule of law, when you undermine the rules-based system, and you stop the United Nations from fulfilling its main mandate of sustaining and maintaining peace and security in the world. You create an insecure and unstable global system, and that's what is worrying in the approach of the American president, in the sense that he is not interested in maintaining peace and security around the world. He's only interested in what is good for America as a country, unilaterally. And I think if you look at Europe, Europe could have played a major role in global affairs. The European Union is a big force economically, but it is subservient to American interests, global interests. It is an appendix of the United States when it comes to global foreign policy. It has not been able to stand on its own, although now, because of the fear that perhaps the United States may not stand with Europe in case of war, they are beginning to fall back to creating, to investing in military
defense,
hardware, military equipment, which may not necessarily be the best thing for the world. The world does not need more armament. The world doesn't need more wars. The world needs peace and security, equity, and social justice, so that we reduce and deal with the underlying problems of insecurity in the world, because poverty, underdevelopment, and so on. But the answer is not entirely military might and military power. For example, one of the great things about China is the fact China's economic rise and dominance is entirely peaceful. It is not based on military dominance, in the conquering of territory, in expansionism, in fueling wars in other parts of the world. And this is a remarkable example that perhaps the world could see as an example. We can all rise as nations of the world, as the people of the world, without spending a lot of our effort and energy on wars of destruction, because that is a lose-lose situation. What we need is a global system that is based on a win-win situation. And that's why we must reject the rule of the jungle, unilateralism, impunity of the powerful states, and go back to the basics. And to a certain extent, the United Nations may not be the perfect institution as people might expect from it, but it forms the basis of building that new, more equitable world order that we're looking for.
Yeah, and Dr. Kanenje, then, having talked about that, and of course we will proceed with it, how does Africa then position itself in this whole debate, given that you talked about pre-colonial times when the United Nations was conceived after World War II, and now with a population that is young, a market that is ripe, climate that is conducive both for investments and life, how can Africa then position itself in light of what we have talked about and the changes that are happening?
The African Union has been, I think, very vocal with regard to wanting to be represented at, especially at the table within the United Nations. For instance, to have a permanent seat there. But I think it's important to remember that you don't get respected when you don't respect yourself. This begging bowl kind of attitude that we've had, I think, needs to stop. Now, it was good that some of the Pan-Africanist leaders came up with African solutions to African problems. But what I've always added is what is more important than African solutions to African problems is do it with African money. Today, as we speak, regionally, IGAD has a budget of about 200 million, the AU about 600 million or so. Most of it is actually funded by foreigners. Do you really want to tell me, as a continent, we cannot raise $600 million? Is money that is stolen in one of the projects in African countries, any, you understand, like in 1 week. Because if we move in that direction, not only are we going to build agency, we're actually going to start solving some of our problems. You see, we have no control over what happens outside there, but at least we have a say. Now, even within the region, for instance, how can we be able to have a vehicle that has to be fueled by somebody else and then expect we're going to determine where that vehicle is going to go? Some of the regional problems we have, we can actually be able to establish a kitty and mechanisms to start funding it. And so one of the things that has also been deviled us as a continent is we've not built our own agency in a way that we build a degree of independence that can allow even others to listen to us. Number two, for us to be listened to, we have to organize ourselves to enhance and build a stronger agency for that. But when we are disparate and divided, and we don't really seem to be having an agenda, or we are waiting for solutions from outside, when it comes to some small problems or some interstate, sometimes with interstate conflicts, we cannot be able to do that. It's actually going to become increasingly difficult. Africa is going to be 2.5 billion people in the next 25 years. Is going to contribute the largest percentage of population that are young and who, in terms of workforce. It's also going to remain one of the fastest growing regions in the world outside the Asia-Pacific region. Do we have these metrics and how do we make use of them? Because the future actually is here. But I think what has been lacking is organization. And as they say, if you're not organized, you're going to remain agonizing.
Then Dr. Winnie, who takes up that mantle? We had seen changes at the African Union Commission with the Djibouti's Mahmoud Yusuf now chairing that. And ideally then how does the AU now see the perspectives of the issues that we had deliberated here and pick up from where Dr. Kanenje had left, then instill that sense of standing up and in a given way be the better equipped person with the manpower. You talked about the population, with the market and with the right environment, be a representative of the continent in the changing landscape that ideally points to a world that is very unpredictable at the time.
Yeah, I think the first thing I just building up on what Dr. Kanenje was talking about is you've asked who will help us get there. And yes, the African Union has a role to play, but I like always going back to the hegemons of every region. Kenya within the East African region, South Africa, Nigeria. These anchor countries within Africa have a very important place. And I just want to make reference to the work of one scholar in South Africa who writes a lot about, he's called Professor Isike, who writes about the role of regional hegemons and how they can push and they can use that power, that leverage to move forward the continent in pushing for a common agenda. And another way that is very important for us to consider as we the African people, the African continent, is moving forward in these geopolitical times is, yes, number one, getting our finances right when it comes to supporting key institutions like the African Union. But number two, it's also taking advantage of, can we say, points that are our strengths. For example, a big strength is our demography. A big strength is our resources. A big strength is the numbers we bring in diplomatic negotiation. We could use those points of agency to move forward agendas that are of interest to us. And I think I was very pleased a few months ago to see South Africa leading in taking Israel to the international court regarding the human rights violations that have occurred. That to me was, I remember tweeting and feeling, this is very refreshing. We're not waiting for external actors to come in and speak on our behalf. And so we are seeing slowly African countries rising. They are rising and they've been continuing to rise, but there are many opportunities to us leveraging our positions. And finally, how do we negotiate in the global stage? And that's where I want to plug in the role of training our diplomats. These are the people in the battleground for us. These are the people who are negotiating for us our decisions that come out. And I feel it's an important time to talk about retooling our diplomats, making sure that they are prepared for this shifting geopolitical times and they're able to advocate very clearly our foreign policy position, whether it's here in Kenya, but also within the continent.
Yeah.
And so institutions of higher learning, Foreign Service Academy, they continue to play a very important role in making sure our diplomatic representatives are doing the right thing for our countries.
Yeah. And Honorable Yusuf, you have been at that very influential committee for some time now. The nominees come before you for vetting. Do we get the best amongst ourselves? And is the caliber questionable, or we are sending the best amongst us to be our ambassadors and representatives?
I think we have some very well-trained, experienced experts out there. But, you know, even if you have the best experts in foreign policy, that expertise can only be effective when you have a very forward-looking, progressive foreign policy, which is proactive. And a good example is South Africa, that has just been mentioned by Dr. Rugut, that they're thinking outside the box as a nation and tackling things that seem to be way above their power configuration or power relationship. And I think to a certain extent we have a very cautious foreign policy, not a very aggressive or outspoken foreign policy. We play it safe because of our circumstances and the region in which we're in, as well as our global position. But I think in the recent past, I have been very worried, and I've expressed that a number of times, that increasingly our diplomats, the diplomats who are sent to the committee for vetting, are increasingly political appointees, are people who do not have the training or the experience to be able to handle some of the complex issues that our foreign policy experts and our missions need to deal with. And we have raised this issue to reduce the number of political appointees. It's absolutely necessary, because the prerogative of selecting diplomats is that of the president, is that the president should have some leverage to appoint capable political appointees, but also reduce that number to a manageable number, so that all the embassies are led by experts rather than by people who come from backgrounds that are not diplomatic or foreign affairs. And I think maybe this...
Should they, in your view, be career diplomats?
I think most foreign services in the world are run by career diplomats, because they are trained. You have specialization. For example, look at all the recent ambassadors to Kenya. They all speak Kiswahili. Many of them, the top countries in the world, for example,
Germany,
the British,
Australia,
the Japanese,
French,
Germany. They are savvy people whom you would find in Homa Bay, in Kwale, in Wajir, and places like that, in Mandera, places you would not expect a diplomat to go. They're increasingly young and dynamic. They're up to date with area issues, regional issues. They are mostly graduates of foreign policy or diplomacy or politics and so on, and they're well equipped. But I wanted to, say something about Africa. And you raised that issue of how can Africa assert its position in global affairs? How can Africa take its place in the global affairs? And I think there is a major setback here that we must address. And in the 1960s, it was articulated by no other person by that great African leader, Kwame Nkrumah, who spoke about African unity, which is the basis of the current African Union. And I would say that at the moment, Africa is fragmented. Yes. The colonially created fragile nation states are not capable of building a powerful economy and powerful political force that can stand its position in global affairs. We are too fragmented and fragile in that sense. We're weak. You cannot have, we have too many Djiboutis and Burundis and Lesotho, small countries that don't simply have the capacity to be able to function properly in meeting the needs of their population. That's why we need a united Africa, and the African Union is a vehicle that can become the building blocks of that unity that we want. And at the moment, we lack the political will and the leadership that can go that way. Because if you look at all big, powerful countries, they're big in population, they're big in territory, and they're big in resources. And unless you can have that scale of economy, and you put your resources together, you're not able to compete in a fast-growing global environment where you have China, India, Russia. In Latin America, you have Brazil, the United States, and the European Union. We would continue to be a third-rate power or a third-rate force in global affairs.
Yeah, and Dr. Kanenje, one of the key pillars of the 8 points pointed out by the foreign policy is economic diplomacy. And the Tanzanian government yesterday said that it will bar foreigners from select businesses in the country. That will affect thousands of Kenyans. With the Suluhu administration now sanctioning infuriating local traders, the MPs have called for Nairobi to impose retaliatory response. And this is in breach of the Common Market Protocol, which was passed in 2010 of the East African Community. Then the starting point should be next door, is it, if Kenya is to engage internationally?
On a lighter note, I think that protocol needs to be translated into Swahili for Madam Suluhu. Yes. I don't know whether it has something to do with the upcoming elections, or something like that. But clearly, this is not just in violation of that protocol, it's a violation of the East African community, itself, and the efforts to integrate the EAC. It's not just going to affect, you remember, there are lots of Chagas who are doing business here. There are lots of Tanzanians who are doing business, in Kenya. And they're in Tanzania, they are in Rwanda, they're in DRC. And when you do that, and then there's a reciprocal approach from the other country, how is that going to work out for you? And I think in responding to this, we need to actually have a dialogue. We need to engage Tanzania. And number one, tell them the practical impact is likely to have, because there's so many. There are tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of Kenyans who live in Tanzania who are doing business, there. They're going to be affected. What is it going to mean? Do they have now to come back, to Kenya? Yeah. It's really militates against the spirit of the EAC. And I think one of the things that I suspect has been missing is as EAC in particular, we need to have a framework where there's constant talking. We are not talking to each other sufficiently. Mm-hmm. And so we've gone back into a silos, and that is extremely dangerous. We need to build both at a governmental leadership level as well as a business and societal level, more relationship. Now, people are a lot more connected in the EAC than actually the leaders are. And I think at a leadership and even at a parliamentary level, remember we have the East African Parliament, why are these issues not being discussed? We need to go back there because it's a type of inward looking that actually kills integration efforts around the world and creates enmity and animosity that is not going to augur very well with the type of, whether for Kenya or for Uganda or for Tanzania. And so it is not in the best interest of Tanzania, it's not in the best interest of East Africa. And the leadership of East Africa should actually start talking about that, because Kenya also has a lot to lose. But if Kenya starts doing the same thing, then Tanzania will also pay a price. Yeah. And it's not a healthy thing. Yeah,
and are you concerned equally at the deteriorating state of democracy in the region, given what happened to activists and journalists as well, who end up being harassed and interrogated and their rights violated, as we had seen with the Kenyan Boniface Mwangi? And how do you then quantify the apparent silence by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, especially when Kenyans are subjected to such treatments?
I will leave the diplomatic aspects, to the ministry to respond to that. However, this is what I'm going to say. What we are seeing on the continent, it's not just a decline generally in democracy, but in a decline in intolerance, And the continent seems to be taking a hint from actually what is happening elsewhere, including Donald Trump's America. And so we're having a world that's actually declining when it comes to application of these values. We're becoming less tolerant. We're becoming more, more selfish. And some of the liberal values that we preached in the better part of the 90s, are simply going away. Now, we need to have an introspection as a region and discuss where do we exactly want to go, and what are the limits? Because the interesting thing about democracy, it's not just good when it should be working for you. It should also be good when it's working even for someone you actually don't agree with. And we need to go back to doing that, because at a time when you're having extremely unsettled young population across the continent that makes up 60 to 70% of it, I think that type of trend may leave very little room for negotiation in terms of democracy being a mediation between the citizens and the government. And this is what leads to unnecessary and undesirable revolution, so to speak, across the world and around countries. And we shouldn't do that, because the young population, most of them, who tend to be right now jobless, and you don't want to make them hopeless at the same time. And they're educated. So we need to really be measured in the way we go about this and recognize that ultimately, perhaps more freedoms and more tolerance is better than perhaps trying to muzzle some of these voices. And it's not just about the East Africa, actually. It's something that is happening around the world right now.
And Dr. Winnie, what is your assessment of what's happening in the Sahel belt? We had seen the coming into power of Traore, who enjoys the support of his people. And Dr. Kanenje and Honorable Yusuf talked about the need for liberal democracy and constitutional order. What is your view of the Sahel belt revolution? Was it in a way ending what they pointed out as neocolonialism, the boundaries that still exist, and the apparent hand of the Europeans and the ex-colonizers in African affairs? And is that rather gaining some traction and support from the public, who today wholeheartedly support Mr. Traore?
Yeah, that's a discussion I've been having a lot with my students in the classroom, in the lecture halls, about why Ibrahim Traore has become very popular in the region. And my thinking, this is mine, I've not done research on it, my thoughts.
Your view.
My views, is I think there's an appetite for a strong leader. A leader who's able to take control of their country, a leader who is able to say no to deals that don't work for their country. And whether this is a country that is quote-unquote democratic, what our citizenry want more than ever before is action that meets the interests of the country. And so just quickly going back to President Suluhu's decision to, bar foreigners from having certain jobs, that's just a reflection of what she, as the leader of her country, is seeing the interests of her people at this time. And so the coup belt, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and the popularity of some of these leaders, to me, is also a reflection of the shifting times of the constituents or the people who live within the continent. And also around the world. If you think about the United States, the reason why they've moved the way they are right now is an interest, but not by one person, Trump, but the people in that country who want to see a more aggressive leader who speaks for their interests first before considering the foreign interest of other entities. And so for me, I know there's a lot of research and need to understand the coup belt better, but it's also worrying then how small instabilities within a country like Kenya, where it can go. Because if you look at Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, those were democratic countries at some point, but they've quickly shifted. So we need to also understand these constituents, the youth, the young people who are really a huge population in our continent, and their needs and what they want. And so that is, I think, consideration for our lawmakers and our those in government as they interact with their constituents.
Yeah. And Honorable Yusuf, is that also the questionable point of what then works for the African continent and the African people? Yesterday we had a discussion here on how we had engineered our constitutional making process, importing some of the elements that are from Europe. Somewhat does the Burkina Faso template apply in many contexts, and is this discussion healthy given your appreciation for democracy and liberal values?
I wouldn't say that I am a kind of a blind supporter of liberal values, given the fact that, in fact, in many of those countries where there has been a violent upheaval, there are underlying factors. There is serious economic crisis. There is extreme poverty and underdevelopment. You have repressive systems that deny basic human rights. And human rights are universal. I don't think that there's a country that can say we don't respect human rights. Every country in the world must have certain standards of human rights, regardless of what you would call that system anywhere. And in the case of West Africa, there was a serious problem of mismanagement. There's a serious problem of corruption and unemployment, youth unemployment. And this is what eventually created the conditions for a military takeover, because the civilian system that they've had were not functioning. And this can happen in any African country for that matter. So I think what you are seeing in West Africa, in the Sahel region, from Guinea to Mali to Niger to Burkina Faso, is a reaction of the African people's condition, and in which these interventions have made it possible to change the discredited systems that were in place. It's a failure of the nation state in Africa to meet its basic needs. And many of these, and we were speaking about African unity, is that many of these nation states are artificial creation. It was a colonial creation. Do you remember when the French were there? There was the West Africa Federation. There was all these countries were under one control. It's only when the French were leaving that these countries fell apart, and each one of them became a nation state in a very difficult situation. For example, in the case of Guinea, Ahmed Sékou Touré refused the continuation of French domination and French policy in Guinea. They said no to the referendum. And the French responded by dismantling the whole system. They took even the bulbs from office buildings and the streets. They left Guinea with nothing. So Guinea, Mali, all these countries have been, over the years, been struggling with a very difficult economic situation. And civilian populations have failed, whether they're elected or not, because many of these civilian leaders came through a coup d'etat or some other form. They were elected, and they kept on extending their mandate. So they were not reflecting the free will of the people of West Africa. And I think this is a reaction to the realities there, which are unique to those countries. And I can see that spreading to other places. It is spread up to West Africa. There could be more coups in West Africa. Even recently, there were rumors of a coup d'etat in one of the other more prosperous West African countries, the Côte d'Ivoire. And eventually, some of these countries descend into conflict, like in the DRC, Sudan, and so on, because of state failure. So there is a major crisis of leadership in Africa. And when you get new leaders like Ibrahim Traore, who by example live an austere life, who are visible within the population, and who have been seen to be making economic and political decisions that are good for the country and progressive in some ways. They become popular, and I think that is the reason why you have him as an example.
Yeah.
Apart from the fact that he's a young African, he's an example to a lot of African, and 60% of the African population is of his age, you know, his generation.
If not younger.
Yes, his generation. So he's a role model for many African people.
Yeah, and Dr. Kanenje, is this, and also up above the Sahel belt was what happened with the Arab Spring, when young voices took to the streets. Mohamed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire in 2010, setting up the Arab Spring, which saw the packing out of office of Hosni Mubarak, Zine Abidine Ben Ali, Muammar Gaddafi, to an extent, of course, NATO's hand in Libya, in the case of Libya. Is Africa now facing renaissance? And in this case, is that driven by its young population who are yearning for good governance and service delivery, healthcare, education, and a working system plus an infrastructure?
The Arab Spring became an Arab winter very quickly, because the status quo fought back, and that is how it got muted. And because it got muted, it didn't get a chance to spread in a way that was natural. Now, you mentioned, and I think I'll be quick on this, about Gaddafi. The overthrow of Gaddafi has a direct impact on what is happening in the Sahel and what has taken place in West Africa, because it opened a can of worms in terms of security. Armed militants proliferated all over the region that has contributed to the kind of situation you see today. But of course, historically, I do agree with Mheshimiwa, is the failure of the system, as it were, but also the perception of external control. There is a joke, and not to be unfair to the French, but there's a joke in West Africa that someone was asked, what is the natural resource of Niger? And they say it is uranium. And what's the natural resource of France? And they say it is Niger, you see. And that has fueled some of the anti-Western sentiments that we see. It's not based on any propaganda that's actually being imported. It's the conditions of people on the ground, to the extent that they get 10 cents out of something that is valued at 1,000. Now, are we seeing a shift within the continent? I'm not sure whether there is a shift, but I think there is a progressive evolution. There is an emergence reality that I think most of the African elite are not exactly recognizing. And that is the emerging generation that do not have ties to the past, may not romanticize the fight for freedom, and may not exactly be where perhaps some of us were, in the years past. And they're demanding new things because they have access to more information. But also at the same time, our economies are not growing fast enough to actually meet those demands. And I think if we start focusing on that, growing these economies, opening up space, strengthening institutions, is going to avoid the Traorinization of the continent, for lack of a better word. Because in the absence of that, then that kind of change becomes inevitable.
Yeah. Okay, Winnie, the last word before we sample the feedback.
Just picking up on him and the strong man mentality, the fact that you need to use force to be able to speak to this constituent, this young demographic, that's very important to consider, because this is a demographic that has more knowledge, it has an access, everybody has a whole library of knowledge on their phone, and so they have greater demands of their leaders, they have greater demands when it comes to getting jobs, and the actual reality, I think the big conversation moving forward to be able to secure our security interests is talking about jobs, because there's a big issue when it comes to making sure that this demographic is active and participates more in the international, in the growth of the country. But finally, I just want to give my last word. I'm currently reading Ambassador Mudhaura's memoir, and he talks about the East African region. I want to just say my final word, because I think regional integration and speaking as a bloc makes sense for a lot of our countries within Africa, because we are too small to speak and make much move and, move forward the needle by ourselves. And if you look at the political will in the re-establishment of the East African community after after it fell, there was a lot of political will led by countries like Kenya, President Moi, and the other countries in the region were really ready to talk. And I think this is time for us to go back to talking, to go back to dialogue, always having opportunities for dialogue. Because as time passes, people forget why these regional institutions are important, why we need to have those borders open, why our strength is in working together. So dialogue is very important right now within the region and in the continent.
Yeah. Okay, Honorable Yusuf.
Thank you. In fact, I fully agree with Winnie, is that I have always been a very strong supporter of East African Union, East African unity. And I've had the privilege of living in a borderless, one currency East Africa. I know about that past, which was wonderful. People don't realize, a lot of our new generation do not realize at one point you could travel from here to Kampala without crossing a border, and then you could go to Masaka or Mtukula and then cross into Tanzania without crossing a border. You could work everywhere in East Africa. For example, my elder brother went to work in Uganda, opened a business in Uganda, and then continued to live in Uganda without being asked where he was from, because he was a member of the East African community that existed. We had common currency, which was unique in the region, and in fact, we were far ahead of many of even the European Union didn't have a common currency at that time. We had common railway service, common airlines, we had common university systems, and somehow, unfortunately, because of poor leadership and lack of vision, it was dismantled. And I think we have a second chance of recreating that. And these regional organizations like the East African Community can be the building blocks for that dream that we have of African unity. It starts at the bottom, and we go upwards to build something better and bigger. But unless we're able to do that, we will not be at the table. We will be on the menu.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's now sample the feedback. The hashtag on X is Citizen Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. Babu Michael says, I feel the so-called New World Order might actually be a new world disorder. If it were truly about order, we would be seeing more peace, not rising conflicts across the globe. Today, most countries seem to promote selfish policies, and that's a dangerous path. Frank Orinde says, we are witnessing a radical shift in the global order, the US pulling out of the World Health Organization and Trump doubling down on the America First mantra signals a fragmented world with old alliances breaking and new centers of influence emerging. Bob Otieno says the return of President Donald Trump is a wake-up call for Africa, especially Kenya, to start relying on itself. The era of New World Order demands self-reliance and strategic independence. Sir Nixon Dugure says a new world order risks ushering in a totalitarian global government and a dangerous system where opposition is crushed, freedoms are erased, and the state controls every aspect of public life. We must remain vigilant. Babu Michael again says, I honestly feel the so-called world order largely points to a shift towards financial independence for certain countries, especially with the Trump administration cutting financial aid to key and sensitive sectors of the global economy. Okelo Mwalimu says no one should begrudge the American government for prioritizing national interests over global ones. However, Donald Trump could have approached aid cuts more cautiously, perhaps with minimal, gradual reductions, especially for programs supporting the underprivileged. Dr. Kananja, thank you for your time.
You're welcome. Dr.
Winnie, thanks for your time. Honorable Yusuf, thanks for your time. Much appreciated for your inputs. We are 12 minutes past the top of the hour. And thanks for watching, waking up with us here on the broadcast. I'll see you tonight at 9 p.m. on JK Live. Till then, good morning.